Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and it was only 5 days ago that we checked in on my 2 yellow buckets with the African night crawlers in them. Bucket number 1 is right here on the bench. Bucket number 2 is up on the shelf against the wall. And we gave them some food, but we pretty much specified that as being their final feeding. It was feeding number 31 here in bucket number 1, feeding number 27 over in bucket number 2, and pretty much the only reason we didn't proceed with migrating the worms out of their current home and into their new home was because their new home wasn't built yet. So I took the time since that last check-in to build 2 new homes for the worms, and we're going to follow through with the idea that we've been kicking around, which is to use my screen, which is what you see right over here, put the material that the worms inhabit down into the screen. All the nice castings should drop through. We're going to catch as many worms as possible within the screen and collect them up in this little plastic box. And then we're going to introduce those worms to their new home. I'm expecting a good bit of material that falls through the screen to have worms in it as well. So we'll be setting up a bait box at the end of it all, with the assumption that we've probably got a good many stragglers that need to be rounded up. So that'll be the finishing step. The bait box I use is just a piece of plastic box that has a whole bunch of holes punched into it. And sometimes I use 2 bait boxes. We could always do that as well, but I think 1 should suffice. And I also imagine that this black tray over here would be what we end up putting the screened castings into. And that's what we'd be fishing the straggler worms out of. So this is the approach we selected because we kept observing how the material in these systems was kind of clumpy, and we thought that, well, let's screen it. Whatever comes through the screen and can be treated as harvested castings, that's great. Anything that, you know, insists on staying together as a clump will get caught in the screen and simply get moved with the worms to their new home. Whether the clump is in that shape, whether it's a clump because it's got a food chunk in the middle of it, or it's just holding together due to excess moisture, at this point it doesn't really matter. Whatever it is that gets caught in the screen with the worms is just going to accompany the worms to their new home. And you know, usually I have a system of material like this in a tray, which I use my hand to scoop out material to load into the screen, but since I'm doing it with buckets here, we're going to simply pour the stuff over into the screen. Hopefully not making too much of a mess. And since I've never done it this way, I don't know exactly what to expect. But it is interesting to see how skinny these poor little worms are. We've been allowing this material that they inhabit to get drier and drier and drier. We even forced the drying by putting a fan on these these buckets, this and bucket number 2, to help dry the material. And well, at this point I'm starting to wonder if perhaps we've allowed the material to get perhaps a little bit too dry. And you know, I didn't really expect to end up with this much stuff. I'm starting to question whether this container here will even be enough to hold it all. I don't want to shake it too much, because I guess what we'll end up with is way too many worms in the finished castings. Not that that's a problem, but you know, it seems like it would be nice if we ended up with the worms in the screen rather than falling through it. But I guess when you let your worms get a little bit dehydrated, they're going to get skimpy in size. So I guess what we're dealing with here is sort of not too much of a surprise to me. During the last few check-ins, when we've given them feedings of only small particle-sized foods like worm chow and we've given them only worm chow and coffee, the foods themselves have been dried too. So I hope we're not dealing with a whole bunch of deceased worms here. I'm seeing quite a number of them already, and even what I'm seeing down in what I'm treating as the finished castings doesn't look too lively. I mean, worms, when they're a little bit dehydrated, will tend to be pretty sluggish, mainly because they're not getting the oxygen that they need, because the moisture surrounding them and the material that they inhabit is where they get their moisture. If the material is permitted to get really dry, then you can end up with some unfortunate worms that are sort of in distress due to not having adequate moisture. I'm starting to wonder if we might have allowed that to occur here. I hope not, because I never really want to let that happen, but once in a while I'll admit that I do let the material that the worms inhabit get perhaps a little bit overly dry, and by doing so making it rather harsh and unhealthy for them to be in. So hopefully we're not dealing with a huge casualty rate, although I am starting to get the sense that we do have something of a casualty rate already, just based on what's getting caught in the screen. And it feels to me like we're almost out of space here in this container. I mean, in a way, I didn't think that there was going to be quite so much stuff that was clumping together this way. But it's so difficult, you know, when you're working in buckets. It's a little bit tricky to access all the material, you know. You try to dig down into it a little bit, you try to till it up, you try to see what you're working on, but it often is a little bit tough to see what you're dealing with. So there are definite drawbacks to working in buckets. I mean, I suppose it is possible that I could have taken a different approach to this. The other approach that I considered, are these all deceased worms? They just don't look good. These poor little guys. Ay, ay, ay. You know, I'm always quite prepared to take any sort of harsh criticism I deserve, and it's usually when we're doing check-ins like this, where the worms are not looking quite as happy and healthy as they could or should, that I get some criticism on my approach. And it's well deserved, you know, because I do experiment with various different approaches, and sometimes I have very good results, and other times I have perhaps not as good results. All right. Well, I do always feel bad when the poor results, you know, end up with casualties. And it does seem like we're definitely dealing with some of that here, regrettably. And it's not by design, you can trust that. It's certainly not by design at all. It's just that we're kind of running really low on space over here, into which I can dump the last bit of material that gets caught in the screen. But you know, at this point I've pretty much emptied the bucket of all the material that was there. So perhaps we can just treat what's here in the screen combined with what's down here in this container as what's going to go into worm bin number 1 that we're going to launch with these little guys and the material that they came over with, this large chunk stuff that didn't pass through the screen. So I am almost thinking that maybe rather than delaying that next step, perhaps it would be best just to proceed directly to moving these little guys into their new home as quickly as possible, because those new bins that I built are what I would even almost consider to be overly damp. So perhaps we can give them the relief that they need right away. So I'm going to go grab one of the bins that we're going to be moving them into. That's going to be this one right here. So let's not hesitate. Like I always do, I'm going to be turning to you guys as the viewers to provide me with your thoughts on just how many worms we're releasing into tray number 1 over here. So besides what's in this box, we're also going to empty the screen. So why don't we begin by doing that, and then hopefully we didn't end up with too many casualties here. All these poor little worms, they're just so small in size. I definitely feel for these little guys. So I think getting them released into their new home as soon as possible is certainly the way to go here. So I'm going to do my best to spread this material out so you can see what we're dealing with here. And then in some future check-in, I'll blend all this stuff in with the materials that are down underneath it. But I think that's right there, the official launch of bin number 1. So let's let these little guys settle in. Hopefully we don't end up with a bunch of casualties on the top surface. And if we do, then shame on me. But after that bin right there has their little worms settled in, we'll proceed to doing bucket number 2. So now while the worms were getting acclimated into their new home, I took bucket number 1 outside and gave it a good rinse, and whatever worms were still in that stuff were simply released into the garden with the fluid. And I'll give those, got a little bit of moisture in here. I'll give the buckets a much better cleaning once we're done with this. So over here we've got bucket number 2 all set to go, and I don't think we're gonna deviate much from the original approach. I think it's just kind of cookie cutter at this point. I do remember though from our last few check-ins of bucket number 2 over here, I somehow had this feeling like the material in this system seemed far less clumpy, and perhaps that means we'll end up with a little bit more castings material harvested from this system than we did from bucket number 1, but I guess that remains to be seen. As far as what got harvested from system number 1, well, it's down there at the bottom of this red bucket, but it certainly doesn't make up for much material. So I think that this material should flow pretty good, so it should make it easy enough to simply pour some out and let us get this show on the road over here with the next batch. And I'm definitely curious to see what sort of condition these worms are in. Let's give this stuff a quick shake and see what we see. Okay. A fairly large amount of this stuff that I poured off actually did pass through the screen, which I think we were able to anticipate already just from the appearance of this stuff. It definitely flows a lot more smoothly for some reason than what had been in bucket number 1. And I just spilled some stuff all over the bench. Not so worried about dropping a few castings on the bench. I was just worried about possibly a worm or two ending up on the bench in a dangerous spot. I just wanted to make sure that that hadn't happened, and it didn't, so nothing to worry about there. Definitely seems to me like this material is piling up a lot more slowly down here, and it does appear like the material is accumulating down in the red bucket pretty nicely as well, so perhaps we'll end up with a somewhat better outcome. I'm just kind of plowing my way through bucket number 2 a little bit just to loosen some material that's down low, but there's certainly enough here to pour off the next quantity, so let's not hesitate. Let's keep this show on the road, or keep this thing moving. Yeah, we're definitely collecting a lot more castings now. It suddenly got a lot heavier, this red bucket. I was actually a little bit surprised at how light it was after we completed doing bucket number 1. Oh, looks like we've gotten a few worms that somehow slipped by here. I'm sure they would have been okay there if we didn't really notice until later, but I figured let's grab them and keep them all together. Well, we're getting there. Perhaps just a couple more passes through the screen and we'll be done with bucket number 2 as well. I don't know, I just suddenly have this sense of urgency, like we've just got to get this job done after seeing what we noticed in bucket number 1, but perhaps in bucket number 2 over here we've got a somewhat different situation going on. I hope that's the case as far as deceased worms go. I guess what gets caught in the screen is a pretty good indicator. Although these are not deceased, these are just slow moving but still alive wormies, so I'm not too worried. I've got perhaps 1 or 2 more screenings remaining and then we're done with bucket number 2 as well. And I am glad to see that as far as the castings go from bucket number 2, we seem to have a whole lot more of it since it's finer and all able to, not all of it, but a great deal more of it is able to pass through the screen. And it also does seem like we've got a somewhat healthier population of worms living here too. Makes me wonder if just the clumpiness in itself is already an indicator of something that's going on that could be dangerous to the worms. So I guess whatever material I'm unable to dislodge and place into the screen will get the same treatment as bucket number 1 got, which is I'll just take the bucket outside, give it a good rinse, and I guess the beneficiary of all that nice liquid full of castings goop are my cucumbers. That's where I poured what I had in bucket number 1 after I rinsed it. So bucket number 2 will get rinsed the same way, and whatever water I rinse the bucket with is left will go to the plants as well. Am I at capacity? Is it just got nowhere to go? Okay. For some reason it feels like the material could go through the screen, but for some reason isn't. As it gets heavier, it is a little bit more difficult to manipulate it and give it the old shake routine to help the stuff pass through. Or maybe I just placed a little more in here than I should have. But I think that's that right there. Here we were able to fit it all into the square box down here. And now we've got some wormies floating around. Now we got a whole lot more castings too, that's for sure. Look at this thing. Almost full. Pretty close to 5 gallons worth of castings from this harvest. So let's just do a quick little triage here to make sure we don't leave any unfortunate worms out on my dry tabletop, and then any worms that fell past the process can also get rounded up here and returned with the rest of them. And I suppose we're left with very little work now. So it's kind of nice that we're making our way to the finish line. Let me go get the other bucket. I mean the other bin number 2. Into which we're going to release these little guys. And once again, I'll be turning to you as the viewers to give me your estimates. Let me know how many worms you think were released into the first bin as well as into the second bin, and leave me a comment. As I always do, I'll be taking everyone's feedback and averaging the results combined with my own estimate to come up with what we consider to be the estimated worm population for these 2 new African nightcrawler worm bins. So let's let these little guys settle in. In the meantime, I'll go do a little housekeeping and rinse out those 2 containers, and then we'll be virtually finished. As with bucket number 1, bucket number 2 was given the same treatment. I took it outside, gave it a good rinse, and it was a preliminary rinse. I got to give these buckets a good cleaning, but all the fluid that was used to give them that initial rinse was used to feed plants in my garden. And now we're getting close to the finish line here. Now we've just got the matter of this harvested castings, which is a pretty nice amount if you ask me. I think these are generally considered to be 5-gallon capacity buckets, maybe not quite as much, but I would say we've definitely got a few buckets, a few gallons worth of castings here in this bucket. And in addition to castings, we're fairly certain that we've also got worms in here, and that's the reason we're going to hold off on using these castings out in the garden until such a time that we've had a chance to round up the straggler worms remaining in this stuff. So, like we've done in the past, we're going to set up that little bait box I showed you earlier to see if we can gather the worms that fell through the screen into this nice batch of finished castings. So the way I'll usually do that is create a little bit of a hole in the middle of the container so that I could partially submerge my bait box. So we'll go ahead and place it right there in the middle of the bin, and then I'll even backfill it since I do have a little bit of a perforation around the edges too. So if any worms are near the surface, they can access the bait box through those side holes too, but I guess for the most part, the expectation is that they're going to be approaching from below through the many holes on the bottom. And what I figured we would use as bait is one of their favorites. A whole bunch of yummy watermelon. So I figured I would sort of spread this stuff out a little bit and then maybe come in here with a little bit of my prepared bedding, so that in addition to the yummy sweet goodness of the fruit, they would also have a little bit of bedding into which they can make themselves at home. So that to me looks like a pretty good arrangement right there. The stuff came out of my freezer, so it should start to emit a good bit of moisture as it starts to thaw. And I guess I can even come back in here with a little bit of moisture just to make sure that the bedding that I'm adding is also nice and damp. And I'm sure some of the moisture that comes off the watermelon will end up in this paper. But just to be sure, I'm going to come in with my spray bottle and dampen it thoroughly. In fact, let's go ahead and do some of that right now. Alright. Seems like my little squirt bottle's probably in need of a little lubrication. Every so often I take it up to the kitchen and I drop a little tiny bit of oil, a little bit of cooking oil down into the piston that does the pumping to help it recoil more easily. But I don't think we have to go much more than that. A little bit of moisture, because we're going to cover it up with one of these pieces of paper, the piece of paper with the cool gold eagles on it that was covering container number 1, bucket number 1, and then this plastic covering right here will help keep the moisture down in the bait box. And then out here the material will be left to dry, become hopefully a little bit less hospitable for worms to want to remain in, hopefully resulting them trying to find someplace better to be. And that better place to be is right there. So we're getting close to the finish line here. What do we got left to do? Oh, I know. And I think some of you also know. So let's proceed to the final step, and then we'll be done. All right. If any of you guessed that the final step was cleaning things up and putting them away, then you're wrong, because those things are boring, and I wouldn't waste your time with that. The final step is to christen the bins. So please join me in welcoming the 2 newest systems in my wormery. These are the African night crawlers, bin number 1 and bin number 2, bringing an end to our yellow buckets, almost, because what remains still is over here in this black tub with the bait box. And at some point we'll have a family reunion, get them all back together again, but for now, this is about the best we could do. So that's it for the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.